The vapor had now assumed almost the thickness and seeming consistency of a snow cloud, the lamps piercing it like stars. And now he distinctly saw shapes, somewhat resembling in outline those of the human form, gliding slowly and with regular evolutions through the cloud. They appeared bloodless. Their bodies were transparent and contracted or expanded like the folds of a serpent. As they moved in majestic order, he heard a low sound, the ghost, as it were, a voice, which each caught and echoed from the other. A low sound, but musical, which seemed the chant of some unspeakably tranquil joy. None of these apparitions heeded him. His intense longing to accost them, to be of them, to make one of this movement of aerial happiness, for such it seemed to him, made him stretch forth his arms and seek to cry aloud, but only an inarticulate whisper passed his lips, and the movement and the music went on the same as if the mortal were not there. Slowly they glided round and aloft till, in the same majestic order, one after another, they floated through the casement and were lost in the moonlight. Then, as his eyes followed them, the casement became darkened with some object undistinguishable at first gaze, but which sufficed mysteriously to change into ineffable horror the delight he had before experienced. By degrees, this object shaped itself to his sight. It was as that of a human head, covered with a dark veil, through which glared, with livid and demonic fire, eyes that froze the marrow of his bones. Nothing else of the face was distinguishable. Nothing but those intolerable eyes. But his terror, that even at the first seemed beyond nature to endure, was increased 1,000-fold when, after a pause, the phantom glided slowly into the chamber. So wrote Sir Edward Bulwer Lytton in his book Zanoni, which everyone should read. Hello, I'm Laurence Galian, and I'm your host here in The Place Inside. Welcome to episode number 36. If you've been archiving the episodes and have any corrections for the episode numbers, please let me know. Corazon, also known as 333, also known as Lord of Hallucinations. Mysteriously, his name is pronounced almost the same way as the Spanish word for heart, corazón. It is said that every mage must someday confront and overcome this being in order to ascend. He is also known as the dweller at the threshold. Corazon will do its best to hinder anybody from reaching ascension or any other goal for that matter. So as the year 2013 is ending, I thought I would tell you how 2012 ended for me. I experienced complete ego death in November of 2012. Basically, the doctors had given up on me. In addition to NMS, I had developed pneumonia. Their drugs weren't working. I had been preparing for a grand change and transformation because December 21st, 2012 was the end of the Mayan cycle, as we all remember. However, I did not expect the change and transformation to come so dramatically. I, as most of you know, reside in Mexico. I'm a United States citizen. How I got here is the subject for another podcast. Unfortunately, in late 2012, I was given a medicine by a Mexican pharmacist who told me that it had a similar way of working as a medicine that I took at that time, but was presently unavailable at the pharmacy. I have suffered from sarcoidosis for approximately 8 years now, and frequently I must take various medications for this condition. Stress can exacerbate sarcoidosis. Stress can actually cause an breakout or an attack of sarcoidosis. Sarcoidosis can mimic almost any disease or condition. Doctors still really don't know what it is. Within 3 days of taking the medicine that the pharmacist gave me, I developed what is called Neuroleptic malignant syndrome, NMS for short. NMS is a life-threatening neurological disorder, most often caused by an adverse reaction to neuroleptic or anti-psychotic drugs. It turns out that I was given Haldol by the pharmacist, and she told me that the Haldol functioned similarly to the medicine I was taking at that time for my sarcoidosis. I wasn't familiar with the name Haldol, and so I took the pharmacist's word for it and started taking the medicine. My first premonition that something was awry was when I first became aware that my body was becoming rigid and that it was becoming more difficult to speak. As the day progressed, my condition worsened. I called the pharmacist several times, who said that she was going to come over, but she never came over to help. By nightfall, I was losing consciousness, and I was rushed to the emergency room. I could not open my eyes, nor was I aware that the ER physicians were trying to communicate with me upon arrival at the hospital. An IV was immediately started, a catheter inserted, as well as diapers, but I was unaware of all of this. At one point, the doctors had to dig their fingers into a pressure point in my sternum in order to snap me out of my delirium for a few minutes, to talk to me, to ask me what had happened. Did I take anything? During the next few days, I completely lost the ability to speak. I developed delirium, muscle breakdown, and had to be physically restrained. The treatment was life support. Quickly, I lost consciousness. It was then that the real psychic events or paranormal events began to unfold. While the doctors were fighting to save my life, and remember, they were fighting on two fronts, the NMS, and I had developed a severe pneumonia. I was fighting a battle that was so real in the spirit realms that I could write 3 books on all that occurred. And all that occurred would not fit into those 3 books. Contrary to the system taught in the Temple of Set and in the various systems of attainment, after the adept has achieved the knowledge and conversation with his holy guardian angel, he then must cross the great abyss where he meets Corazon, who will tempt him to hold on to his subjective self and become trapped in this realm of illusion. To escape the abyss, the adept gives up his deepest sense of earthly identity in the symbolic gesture of pouring out his blood into the cup of Babylon. The adept then becomes as a babe in the womb of Babylon, impregnated by Pan, and his lifeless self becomes as a pile of dust, taking rest in the city of the pyramids, which lies under the night of Pan. This is why it is called night. It represents the lightless womb and also the time before the dawning of the new sun, or rather, the new self. He then awaits in this sublime state until he is ready to be moved on to the next stage and become born again from the great mother of Babylon, begotten by Pan. In the Temple of Set, to which this author belonged to for a short while and then was kicked out of, it is taught that one must hold on to his subjective self, the very opposite of the gnosis of Aleister Crowley. When I was unconscious, I was confronted by Corazon, who masqueraded as the leader of a cult, or as it is called in Mexico, a cartel. This was not a drug cartel per se, but a cult devoted in an external sense to playing music and living close to nature, while eschewing the bourgeois life of rich North Americans, rich gringos. Members, myself included, were taught how to steal from the public in order to make enough money to live decently on the streets. The only and very flexible rule being that if the object to be stolen was secluded or hidden in some way by the person to whom it belonged, or if the person to whom it belonged to were holding it, say in their hands, then it was not permitted to steal the object. See, this cult had apparently some kind of moral values. If the object, however, was in plain view and unprotected and unguarded, the member had full rights to claim it for himself or herself. However, to jostle someone who might be falling asleep while holding on to a bag or a piece of jewelry in order to loosen it from their grasp, or to accidentally knock open a clasp of a pocketbook in order to take something inside, this was not considered stealing. In other words, they bent the rules quite a bit. As many of the readers and listeners know, I am a professional musician, having studied classical piano privately since the age of 6. However, I gradually realized the manipulative, and this is Crowley's actual word for dark magicians, and power-hungry nature of this cult leader. Corazon wanted me to be one of his top men, or at least that is what he led me to believe. Night after night, I would be tortured by Corazon in the most horrible of fashions to see if I would faithfully follow him or seek to break away from him. Most of the torture devices I've never seen before, until I was subjected to their agonizing effects. Finally, I did let go of everything. I gave up my deepest sense of earthly identity in the symbolic gesture of pouring out my blood into the cup of Babylon. I just let go of all that I might consider myself and entered into a profound and deep unconscious darkness. It was blackness. As I just mentioned, the adept then becomes as a babe in the womb of Babylon, impregnated by Pan, and his lifeless self becomes as a pile of dust, taking rest in the city of the pyramids, which lies under the night of Pan. In actuality, during the struggle with Corazon, I had to piece by piece give up every part of my physical body, even to the point of not even having a grave to lay my bones. I had to agree to have my bones pulverized into dust. I have no idea how long I was in this state of taking rest in the city of the pyramids, which lies under the night of Pan. It might have been minutes, it might have been hours, it might have been days. But suddenly, light poured into my eyes. As my eyes opened, I heard a nurse shout in Spanish, "He's opened his eyes!" And a rush of nurses and doctors surrounded me, apparently amazed that I was out of my state of unconsciousness. A great many people who have NMS go into coma, so I may well have been comatose as the struggle with Corazon was taking place. I realized out of all this, believe it or not, how precious friendship is. Because on that day when I was desperately calling my pharmacist for help, and no one was coming to my assistance, you know who came to my assistance? My landlord and landlady. And they sat with me all day as I lay in bed in the most disgusting of conditions. And they were wiping and cleaning my face and taking care of me. They didn't have to do this, but they did this all day long. Eventually, around 10 p.m., as I'm told, or 11 p.m., calling the ambulance. Well, anyway, I saw who my real friends and family were, and who were just bullshitting me. That's why I'm making big changes on Facebook. When I lay dying in the hospital, I could count on the fingers of one hand the amount of people that were there for me. I realized that there are forces that attack those of us who are working to help those who truly desire it, to attain self-actualization, or you can call it self-realization. But I also realized that attacks have two sides, like everything on this planet, yang and yin. You can be destroyed by them, or you can use them to ascend to a new level. Well, I'm sure you want to hear details of my experiences. They're always the most juicy part of any story. So I'll share some of them with you. Actually, as I said, to go into all the details would take a lot more than 3 books, and I could go on and on. But actually, there were 2 trips to the emergency room, only a few hours apart. Suffice it to say that during my first trip, I was conscious enough to know what was happening around me. The hospital incompetently and unprofessionally discharged me after just one night in the emergency room. They tend to assume that American men my age are ex-Vietnam veterans, strung out on drugs, living on the streets of Mexico, and that I was simply going through heroin withdrawal. Talk about stereotyping, huh? Just like we stereotype Mexicans. It was the second trip to the ER when my landlord and landlady called for the ambulance and I had to be rushed to the hospital, and I sank into unconsciousness. Without going into great detail, at one point during the first stay in the ER, a young, dark-skinned Mexican teenager was brought in by ambulance. As the ER was full to capacity, they put him literally only 2 feet to my side. We were both in separate beds, but they slipped his bed right next to mine. He had been shot in the head. I could not help but witness this young man in his death throes and agony. They then wheeled him into surgery. When he returned, his skin was as white as a Norwegian. He was on a respirator, and my intuition told me I was looking at a dead man. Shortly thereafter, this was confirmed to me. I didn't have time to process any of this because shortly thereafter, I was also fighting for my life. What's truly amazing were the visions I had. While my body struggled to live, these visions were not hallucinations in the sense of something produced by mental illness, nor were they what is called ICU psychosis. These visions each had profound stories to tell. In previous podcasts, we've talked about the importance of story to the human condition, to what it means to be human. These visions were almost endless in their variety, yet at the same time there was a thread that tied the majority of them together. And as you will see, they responded to spiritual intervention. They were a journey through the vast terrain and battlefield that is the human mind, especially the mind of one who has stepped forth into this astral world on previous occasions and declared his intentions to do battle for the sake of humanity. To begin, I should say that the majority of the visions focused around a very charismatic man. Now remember, all that I'm about to say did not happen in what we call quote-unquote reality. It all occurred in my, if you want to call it, head, while my body was near comatose, or in a state of coma. The man had blonde, curly hair. He had a very noble-looking face, very mesmerizing. In fact, I couldn't take my eyes off him. His profile was beautiful. Even though he was in his 50s, I don't think I've seen a more beautiful human being in my life. Rembrandt, in all his glory, could not have painted a more poignant face. He was a cult leader. But this did not come out right away. I am not a religious man, you know that, and I don't believe in the devil. However, the concept of Lucifer having been at one time the most beautiful of all the angels comes to mind when I think of this individual, Corazon. At first, he pretended to be a musical producer, a guy who had a famous hit record in the Latino music genre many, many years ago, and who is now starting up a new internet Latino radio station out of Miami. At first, he entranced most of the nurses in the hospital, the staff, and enthralled them with his stories about the music business. The reason he was in the hospital was he had been shot, and his girlfriend was there with him, as well as his manager. And I remember him telling his girlfriend that this is part of what it's like to be a musician in a Latin American country, that she knew this when she got involved with him. And she realized that this was the dangers of getting involved with a musician. Also, the manager was there with him, but the manager's always walking around. The manager, I don't know, he really didn't seem to give a shit one way or the other. He was more interested in the money. One night I heard one of the nurses begging him to sing her his hit song from way back when. She figured he was going to die that night, and she wanted to be the last person he sang to. She wanted to be in the newspapers the next day as the woman that this famous singer sang his song to for the last time. Then the next day, and please remember, all this is going on in the astral realm. The man in charge of hospital finances came to pay the musician and his manager a visit. He asked him, "So, you say you came here by car, is that right?" "Yes," replied the musician. "And yet you also say you came from Cuba." "Yes," again replied the musician. He was in great pain. I mean, after all, he had been shot. "And you want us to believe that you drove your car from Cuba to Mexico?" There was silence from the musician and his manager and his girlfriend. The financial head said, and all this was happening in Espanol, "Actually, we know you. You've been in this hospital before, and you owe us a great deal of money, which you've never paid us. You must leave the hospital today." The musician and the manager tried all sorts of ways to use their fame and leverage to stay in the hospital. And he managed to stay a couple of more days. And that night, he wanted to show me something. What he did, remember, he was shot in the stomach. He got out of his hospital bed and was walking around like a man in the peak of health, totally healthy. He wanted to show me that there was something very unusual about him. But then, of course, before morning came and the nurses came back, he went back into the hospital bed and was back to moaning and groaning. Eventually, the administration of the hospital came and kicked him out, along with his manager and girlfriend. However, that night he returned, and he returned with a vengeance. He revealed to the administrator and others that he was the head of a cartel that operated in the hospital. Not a drug cartel, but a gang of sorts, nonetheless. The head of the cartel held control, he explained, of much more than 50% of the employees in the hospital. He made it clear that he was the boss and that everyone had better obey him. His first demand was that the hospital make huge donations to his quote-unquote charitable group, which he introduced as a kind of shelter, refuge for the homeless, which supposedly helped the homeless survive on the streets of Mexico. One night he showed me how he could control the whole hospital, that actually everyone including some of the doctors even, belonged to his cartel. I made several attempts to escape the cartel, which translated to my actually, in real life, screaming at the top of my lungs in Spanish for help and shouting that I was kidnapped. I physically attempted to climb out of my hospital bed. I don't know the details. I don't know how far I got. I have no memory of this. I was told that the hospital staff had to restrain me. I was tied to the hospital bed, and they did something also with the catheter, tying it up in a certain way that I could not move even a little bit to the left or to the right without causing myself enormous pain in my penis. The fact that they didn't rotate me at all, which is absolutely mandatory in a hospital, caused me to develop a stage 4 bed sore. But that's another story. Now, while I was laying there in the hospital, again in the astral realm, I saw a friend of mine from St. Louis. And I remembered he had told me all about Cuernavaca, and that he had told me about how great this hospital was, because this hospital would routinely take in the homeless who were sick and treat them for free. He told me that they would give free antibiotics and a free sponge bath to the homeless, that it was a good deal. But he explained that his main reason, and I remembered this, again in the astral, imagine remembering something in the astral realm. I remembered that he had said that the main reason he moved from St. Louis to Mexico was to be with this musician, this cult leader. My friend said that this man was a great musician, better even than the Grateful Dead, and that my friend was hoping to learn to be a better musician by jamming with this cult leader. Well, this cult leader, while he pretended to be the friend of the homeless, was actually a psychopath who would torture me frequently to see if I was on his side or if I would attempt to escape. So I devised various ways of tricking him into believing that I would be on his side. Nevertheless, the torture continued. Some of the torture consisted of burning my ass, literally. Now, after my hospitalization in real life, I visited a museum here that has currently an exhibition of torture. And while I was wandering through this museum, I could see that nothing that the Inquisition came up with could hold a candle to the inventions of this psychopath. It would take too long to describe in detail the torture devices, but essentially they were designed to burn my ass at random times using aerosol cans and flames. I was also shown what were kind of commercials in a way of various creams, ointments, and other substances that could prevent the fire from burning me. The pain was agonizing. And of course, all these medications were available for a price. And I realized that was the whole point of this cartel, that they had me in the hospital, and their goal was to steal all my money and eventually obtain even my passport and all my legal identification. Well, I managed to purchase enough medicine to stop the pain 75% of the time. It probably goes without saying that in order to stop the torture, I had to give them more and more money. They slowly bled me dry, no pun intended, until I had to give them my passport and all my possessions. But it didn't stop there. They wanted my very life. Well, let's talk about the life review. I'm sure all of you who have studied metaphysics and the paranormal have heard that before one dies, one's life flashes before one's eyes. Or in more sophisticated versions, that after death, one examines one's life in great detail. There have been television shows and many movies about this. Well, let me tell you, it is not like Hollywood would have you believe. I was dying. In real life, I was dying. And my life review in the astral was very much real. However, in my case, all my friends who I had ever given anything to, or who had some connection with me, generally through my physical possessions, came to my quote-unquote home with all my belongings. It was fascinating. They had gone to great lengths and tracked down all my possessions from all years past, purchasing them from various garage sales and estate sales. They had tracked down all the various different apartments where I had lived in and rooms that I had rented, and contacted my landlords and landladies to see where my things were, and they brought them all with them. In some ways, this strongly reminds me of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Each friend took their turn and showed me and explained about a particular object, and we talked in great love and friendship about how I obtained it, or how I made it, and so forth. A lot of it were my possessions from when I was very much involved with neo-paganism. Swords, athames, staves, pentacles, so on, but much more. This showed me how very important and sacred are the possessions we have in life. I'm speaking about those things that have great significance for us. In my case, for example, a magical staff and a music album I had recorded played a big role. Actually, it was an album of interviews I had done, where I had gone and interviewed all sorts of famous people including Whitley Strieber, which surprised me. We must not take our possessions for granted. They are tied to us in mysterious and profound ways, beyond life and into death. But also, as the Tibetan Book of the Dead teaches us, we must also then yield up each and every one of our possessions, including every piece of clothing that we own. Now, back to the cult leader. I see that I'm not going to have enough time to finish all that I have prepared for you. But if you want more, I'll tell you more. But we'll go on for just a few more minutes. This cult leader, remember, this was Coronzon, the master of illusion. He offered me various options because he liked me. If I decided to stay with him in his group, I could run what he showed me would be my own fish restaurant on a remote section of a beach, catching the fish myself each day and selling them to customers at night, to just make enough money to have a little restaurant shack on a Mexican beach and survive. Sounded like a pretty good life. I was also taken, like Jesus was taken by the devil, to a mountaintop in the desert of what I thought was New Mexico, somewhere. There I met a man who lived with a woman, and they lived in a nice tent. He was wearing a real nice cowboy hat. The deal was that people paid him to take his cowboy hat off, because when he did, you could see that he had had most of his skull removed, and you could see how he could manipulate a very tiny spinning wheel with his now very visible brain. He made enough money off of the tourist to get by. The cult leader was very big into cutting pieces of people's bodies off. I began to notice that many of the hospital staff were missing parts of fingers or had very severe piercings, and even some were missing portions of their limbs when I looked more carefully. He told me that eventually he was going to totally cut me to pieces because I was not respectful enough to him. He saw me as a threat. He said that I had no business coming into Cuernavaca and trying to steal his spiritual students. In real life, I did not attempt to steal anyone's students, but I have been learning more and more about the big role that black shamanism and witchcraft play here in Mexico. In fact, for those of you who follow me on Facebook, you know that I believe I was given a natural plant drug known as toloache by a woman who studied with the indigenous Indians of Mexico for a long time. This drug turns a person into a zombie. In other words, dazed and compliant. And criminals in real life routinely use it. It's especially famous in the country of Colombia, but it's very much known here in Mexico. in Mexico, strangely, they think that it's a love drug. Very jealous women, extremely fanatically jealous women, think that they can make their boyfriends or husbands love them by giving them this drug. But the criminals in Colombia and here usually use it to make people withdraw all their money out of ATMs, or else to give them all their valuable possessions like TVs, stereos, and so forth. The drug completely removes a person's willpower, but leaves them lucid and able to walk and talk. Now, can you just imagine if this got into the possession of, say, the CIA or one of the alphabet agencies of the government? And do you think for one moment that it isn't already in their possession? So, whatever the victim is told to do, they automatically obey. Since we don't have time to finish all the story, I will end by telling you how it ended for me. After 3 weeks or so of this constant testing and torture, someone in real life put a Walkman on my head and played some sacred chanting. Suddenly, while I was in the astral being tortured, the torture machine lost all its power to hurt me. I started smiling, and the people who were torturing me became outraged, and the cult leader, he couldn't believe what was happening. And I turned and I smiled at him, and he realized then and there that it was over. No more pain. I laughed at him, and he turned away and walked down the road and walked away from me. But yes, 2012 was very real for me and changed my life. It has continued to change dramatically since the hospitalization. It took over 8 months during 2013 to fully recover. Rules that if you choose a negative existence, slowly you destroy yourself physically. But if you choose to know that you are the very representative of universal forces, drawing fire down from heaven, the divine man, the divine woman, a shining star, the son or daughter of God, the emissary, then you are capable of doing amazing feats. The Catholic Jesuit theologian Teilhard de Chardin saw creation as composed of ever more complex entities. He was the first to draw attention to the fact that the French word for magnet, aimant, means lover. In his concept, the magnetic attraction that a piece of metal, quote-unquote, feels for a magnet is a, albeit very primitive, form of love. The love that a she-wolf feels for her pups is a more complex form of this. The love that one human being can feel for another human being is still more complex. And the love of God is the most complex of all. In other words, just as all creation is part of the manifestation of the divine into matter, so is love the all-pervading force that binds creation together. But this isn't the kind of love you see every day on Facebook with pretty sunsets or flowers and sweet sayings. This love is achieved one painful step after another. First, as you learn to observe yourself and find the real you in the midst of the crowd of people in your head. This kind of love is found in the frightening darkness of the unconscious, in deep underground caverns, and not in some Hawaiian sunset accompanied by a quote from Rumi or by some New Age author and the music of Yanni playing in the background. This love is cosmic love, and it doesn't take the shape of a Valentine's Day card or a love song. Not that we reject the natural world. The natural world is one of the greatest teachers of all. But a volcano is just as expressive of love as is a rose. But if you've got the courage, you can find this love, find out who you are, and find your place in this universe. But you must embrace the thorn as well as the flower in order to inhale the transforming, intoxicating perfume of the rose. This way isn't easy, but I promise you it is effective. It takes plenty of work, but it will transform your life. So if you do have the courage, let me know you're out there. Sign up for the Facebook Laurence Galian public figure page. For now, I'm leaving it open as a page and not yet forming a group. I want to see what sort of people want to participate in exploring what is really happening in the inner and outer worlds. That is your homework. 80,000 people listen to just one of my podcasts. Let's see how many people are going to have the courage to get off their asses and make the commitment to having a real life. That's what I'm offering you. Keep your eyes open. I'm finishing up the new book that New Falcon Publications has commissioned me to write about Aleister Crowley. I promise you, it will blow your mind. In the meanwhile, if you haven't gotten your copy of the new edition of Beyond Duality, The Art of Transcendence, please show your support of our work and purchase a copy today. We will be in contact soon.